Pleased to introduce Jenna Rickus. She is Associate Professor of Agricultural and Biological Engineering and Biomedical Engineering at Purdue University. She is a member of Purdue Discovery Park, Burke Nanotechnology Center, and the Bindley Bioscience Center. Rickus mentors Purdue International Genetically Engineered Machine, iGEM team, and teaches the Purdue Honors course, Synthetic Life. Today, she'll present a talk titled Synthetic Life, Our Hybrid Future.
All right, before we get started, I'm just going to point out as well, we're sort of trying something new. If you have thoughts and ideas you want to share along the way, you can text your thoughts and ideas to this number, and we'll be collecting them and addressing them. And when we post the talk, and we'll try to post some of the thoughts from the audience as well. Okay, so this is going to be fun. Let's get started. So first, where I want to start is just defining what is it I'm talking about when I'm talking about synthetic life and our hybrid future. So let's start with what we know, with the natural world. Okay, and we're going to just sort of organize our natural world by scale and complexity. Okay, so let's start, we could argue over how low we're going to start. Let's start at viruses. Okay, so we've got a virus particle. We can move up to microorganisms, bacteria, up the complexity, organizational scale, organs and multicellular organisms, such as plants. Next, you might find primates, including us, right? So, and even farther along, we're going to take a huge leap out into the universe, okay? Now, I'm going to put in a couple boundaries here, and I'm going to say on this side of this line is our non-living world. And when we get to microorganisms, we generally agree this is when we sort of enter into the living emergence of life, okay? And so then we can look at some of these other spaces, if we go in the upper left, and create this boundary of everything that's on top is now synthetic. So in the upper left, when we talk about things that we make synthetic, that are on this smaller scale, on the scale of viruses, a lot of traditional nanotechnology may fit in this area, whether bottom up or top down, assembling things at that nanoscale, such as nanoparticles. If we look way on the other end of the spectrum of the complexity, and we talk about non-living complex things, we might put our computers and robots that we have today in our world. So what about this big open space in the middle that's now living, but synthetic? What exists here? And this is the space that I'm calling synthetic life, and where much of our hybrid future, and I'll define what this is here in a minute too, where this exists. So by looking at this, we can say where we cross these lines. How do we cross these lines? And where we cross these lines is where we get into synthetic life. There's a couple different ways we can do this. So if we cross the natural to synthetic boundary, we can re-engineer life. Right? We can re-engineer microorganisms. We can re-engineer us, even. We can also cross into this space across the other boundaries and take what our engineered world that's currently non-living into a living space. When does emergence of life? And on the right here, so there's several technologies, active areas of research happening now. With artificial intelligence, many of you have been to AI talks all throughout the day, the main theme of our symposium. AI fits into this. But what I want to talk about and understand too is these other technologies, including bio-nanotechnology, synthetic biology, tissue and neuroengineering, that have the potential to cross these boundaries from these other directions as well. AI is going to exist with all of these other technologies commingling, and it'll be a merger of these into what I call our hybrid future. Okay? So this is the space that we're going to focus on today. And when I talk about hybrid, traditionally, we think of our engineered world and our biological world as being very separate. So if I organize these by hierarchy, when I think of our engineered world, and I have a more electronics example here, right? So computers are made up of chips, made up of circuits, which are made up of smaller individual transistors and components that make our circuits, which are made up of materials, made up of atoms, the types of atoms we associate this world, silicon, platinum, gold, copper, these types of things, right? And the same sort of hierarchy exists on the biological side, right? From, that happens to be my daughter up there, Lauren, from my daughter Lauren, right, to the cells that make up her, which are made up of molecules like DNA, which are made up of atoms that, the atoms of life tend to be carbon, oxygen, or organic world, right? But there's nothing fundamentally incompatible about these chemistries. And in fact, there's a lot of hybrid inorganic, organic chemistry that have a lot of natural, even in our natural world, mingling, okay? And so, again, up this scale of hierarchies, we have example of this hybrid world we've created. From hybrid chemistry to here we have an example of genetic circuits. These are and/or logic gates constructed out of DNA parts, right? To cells interacting with biochips as a plant cell on a lab on a chip system here, up into hybrid systems, implantable computer and electrical devices implanting into our brain, okay? So this is what I'm sort of imagining, this merger of engineering where the precursors exist, all of these things up this scale exist today. Where is this gonna go? And what does that mean? So before I go on though, why hybrid? Why do we need the bio? To push our technology, why can't we just keep pushing computers, pushing electronics, pushing the mechanical, our traditional, why can't we do everything we need to do in our traditional engineered substrates and constructs? Well, as stated by George Church, who's one of the founders and thought leaders of synthetic biology, states in a foreword to this new textbook that just came out in synthetic biology, a quote from him. He says, and many agree, biological engineering is posed to outdo all previous engineering fields. He argues this based on these three reasons. That biology gives us the ability, we can miniaturize and engineer in 3 and 4 dimensions. That fourth dimension, time, right? Biological systems evolve. There's a lot of power in that. We've inherited billions of years of evolutionary innovation and testing with an unparalleled list of parts, systems, and applications. And we can combine these things to produce accelerated evolution of engineering. And current estimates of even accelerated Moore's law, many of you are very familiar with the concept of Moore's law, that in the recent period of time, the rate of biotechnology is increasing at a rate of 8-fold per year. Much of this is based on estimates of our ability to read and write DNA, for example. So the argument is that there's a lot we can do by bringing biology into the engineering equation that will advance us much farther than just sticking with our traditional engineering substrates. Okay, so now to help build in your mind a little bit more what these more specific examples, we're going to go through a couple areas in neuroengineering and synthetic biology to give you an idea what I'm talking about. And we're going to compare. Much of our experience and thought about some of these things comes from science fiction. So in each one of these, we're going to look at what is the science fiction example and what is a state-of-the-art science example that exists today. So neuroengineering, neural implants, right? Our science fiction example is like the Matrix, right? You jack in, you download a jiu-jitsu program, and the next thing you know, you're kicking Morpheus's bum in, your martial arts arena. Right? That's our science fiction example. Where's state of the art? This comes from the Center for Implantable Devices here at Purdue. Pedro Rithoki, good friend of mine, we were both neuroengineering graduate students together at UCLA. This comes from his lab. This is the latest in their wireless neural implants. So all of the power and communication out is totally wireless. Records and both stimulates the brain. And of this size, they can put up to 8 in one patient. Okay, so that's sort of the state of the art right now in putting fully functional, programmable, by the way, devices into the brain. So when I was preparing for this, and the journalist that was interviewing me asked, why? And I realized, okay, why isn't always an obvious question to everybody. So for each of these, I want to give an example why. Why are we doing this? Why is Pedro making these wireless devices that we can put 8 in the brain? Well, one of the reasons why is because 1% of the world has epilepsy, 30 to 40% of the patients have drug-resistant seizures. Many of those patients are totally devastated by their seizures. And so our traditional route of drugs, new drugs keep coming in, and those drugs keep helping the same population of patients. We need a new way. Neuroengineering has been, and these neural implants, has been one of our best paths, looks like, to fixing this for some of these patients. Okay, another aspect of neuroengineering. More broadly, the brain-computer interface, controlling and interacting with the outside world. Okay, our science fiction example, many of you have seen Avatar, right? And this AMP war exoskeleton they use to fight, connecting the human to this exoskeleton robot-like thing. Today, I don't know how many people saw this, but the 2014 World Cup was actually started with a kick using a mind-controlled exoskeleton from a quadriplegic patient. Okay, so this comes from a guy's lab named Nick Lalis, based in Duke, and has a lab in Brazil. His lab has been working in this brain-computer interface for a while. So this patient, and what I mean by mind-controlled, so this is a non-invasive cap recording of electrical activity in this young man's brain. And then he learns to map by his thoughts the pattern of controlling that. He can control this exoskeleton and what it does by his thinking. Okay? And connecting those recorded electrical activities to this exoskeleton and the outside world. So again, why do we do this? We do this has been primarily driven, this field of neuroprosthetics, to restore the ability to experience and engage with the world for people who have lost that ability, right? There's a really interesting book and book called Rebuilt. You probably can't read this, but it says, How Becoming Part Computer Made Me More Human. It's about the experiences of the author being from the hearing community, losing his hearing, and then receiving a cochlear implant and rejoining the hearing community. So that human aspect of that, very interesting and maybe initially counterintuitive sort of title there. Okay, next topic. Tissue engineering. Organs in the lab. Okay, this is sort of our I love this movie, right? One science fiction example, right? Frankenstein is like our classic reanimation. Real science. So this one comes from my lab over here on the right. So on the left, you've got, from a microscope, an image of a real human brain. On the right, what you're looking at are tumor cells that have come from a brain tumor from a patient and have been re-implanted in an engineered 3D brain in the lab. And you're watching these cells migrate along a pseudo blood vessel in that engineered brain. Okay? Why do we do this? Well, we do this because the median survival after diagnosis with glioblastoma is about 15 to 18 months. And that number has not moved significantly in decades. Again, much like epilepsy, our current approaches are not working. And current cell and animal models do not predict therapy outcomes in humans. Those cells act differently when they're in the human brain than they do when they're in a culture dish. So we're engineering a human brain so that we can study how and why those cells populate the entire brain and how they evade the current therapies that are not working. Another field I mentioned was synthetic biology. So one area of synthetic biology, writing novel genomes. Okay? Science fiction example of this may be the Hunger Games, right? Those synthetic creatures that they made to torment the competitors in the games. You may or may not be familiar with, in 2010, sort of a big moment, actually the first genome transplant of a totally chemically synthesized genome was transplanted into another microbial cell. So, and what I mean by this, from just chemistry, synthesizing sequences of DNA, they assembled them into a functional genome, took the genome out of one bacterial cell, transplanted that new chemically synthesized genome that they wrote into and booted up, so to speak, in that cell. And the cell had the properties of the synthetic genome, okay? Why? Why do we do this? Why do we do synthetic biology? Synthetic biology has potential to affect a lot of different areas. One reason we do this, one example is, well, human global extraction of Earth's raw materials is about 70 billion metric tons a year, the majority of which are things like minerals, fossil fuels, and ores, right? So to give you an example, the introduction mentioned iGEM. We have a couple iGEM students in the audience, I see actually. So iGEM is the International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition. Undergraduate students from around the world compete with this, and they are simply challenged with using synthetic biology, coming up with ideas, and designing and building those to solve much of the world's problems. So last year's competition had 215 teams, and you can see the areas, the tracks in which they worked, covered the whole spectrum of the types of engineering problems we work on, from health and medicine to the environment, food and energy, manufacturing. And so I encourage you to check out iGEM to sort of see all of these ideas that are being generated by undergraduate students from around the world. So I've given you some examples. I've given you the positives, the why, what's driving these technologies, the people who are working on it now, what's motivating them, and why. But it's not so hard to see when we extrapolate out into the future sort of how these technologies could really sort of change our world and existence. And I think we've seen from human nature and from technologies that often early started in clinical need, once they become mainstream, enter our everyday lives in commercial sense and in consumer products and all sorts of things. So these technologies raise some important questions that have to be part of the discussion. And this is why this framework that I constructed for you really helps me, because I can look at this and say, what defines these boundaries? And is it important for us to know and to think about when we cross these? And does that mean something? Okay? So, and you quickly get to questions about what is life? What does it mean to be living? How do I know I've crossed that boundary? What does it mean to be human? Right? What is synthetic? And does synthetic naturally equal unnatural? Right? So these are some of the things that we'll talk about, and it's these questions that frame a lot of the discussion in my honors course that we mentioned. So a lot of my thoughts have really come from interacting and engaging with honors students at Purdue in discussing these areas. So one of the things I have my students do, I don't know if you've ever tried to do this, it sounds very simple, but creating a working definition of life. And I mean an all-encompassing one, right? Have you ever tried to teach your children, you know, that one of the things they do in preschool, living, not living, right? Categorization and organization. Well, there are some examples that get a little challenging, okay? So when I ask my honors students to do this, there's many different ways people end up approaching this, okay? Some of the themes by function, well, living things metabolize, they evolve, they replicate, right? My computer doesn't do that, at least not now it doesn't. Even from a thermodynamics point of view, right? Living organisms are taking in and storing energy, they're actively doing work to create organization and fight entropy, right? They're organizing themselves. And once they're stop metabolizing and stop able to do that, right? Then it's easy to sort of define death. When we die, our molecules, all that organization tends to destabilize, degrade, and we disintegrate, right? Control, responding to surroundings, striving for conservation, a cognitive approach, things that are goal-oriented, self-aware. And some students say it's beyond our current understanding or beyond our understanding ever, right? That there's something about life that the human intellect cannot fathom, that we have to evaluate it case by case. I can't write a unified definition of life, and that life can come in many forms. So some students just throw up their hands and say, we can't, it's not even possible to make this. So would it really be, so everyone does this assignment, they come back and they all talk about it, everybody has their definition, and then they realize, okay, well there's something unsatisfactory about their definition, they're gonna tweak it a little bit. But where it really becomes challenging is when you test your definition. One of the ways I like to do this, there's a great book, it's actually a collection of short stories by Stephen Baxter, and it's science fiction that goes very far in the future. And what's great about it in this context is that it encompasses all these different life forms, some that humans don't even recognize as life. And it gives us all of these examples in a literature, in a story that we can use to test our definition, okay? And so there's 4 characters in some of the short stories my students read. First, there's Eve. Eve is a representation, a simulation of one of the other characters' dead human wife. And this virtual simulation knows everything, has all the old memories, can learn, and can create new memories with her still living husband, okay? Then there's Jack, Eve's husband. He's a man whose body, physical human form, has been totally replaced with an alien metal-like form. And he can also exist with Eve in virtual reality, okay? Then there's this alien called the Sync Ambassador. And this alien has the same natural form as Jack. He's always, well, as far as we know, always been in this form. And then there's another alien creature we encounter, Sculptor 472, that's made of ice, helium, hydrogen, a few hydrocarbons, but very not things we associate, right, with living things here. And in fact, the astronauts and the human space travelers don't recognize it as life at all. Okay? And it sort of operates and moves on a different time scale and can't communicate with the humans, which makes it difficult for the humans to even recognize it as life. But it turns out that this creature has a family, is very goal-oriented, trying to survive, and it turns out the humans coming are actually killing this population, and the humans aren't even aware of it. So I have the students test their definitions. Okay, and the student responses, there's some interesting things we learn from this exercise and from what my students come back and say. They say Eve, majority. First of all, they can't all agree. But there's some good consensus here. First of all, the majority of them say Eve, not alive, but Jack is. Okay? They say this Sync Ambassador, I can't decide, I don't know. But Sculptor, every single student, the most foreign and unusual appearance of all of these, they all agree, definitely alive. What's interesting about this is that the substrate, the chemistry of that life, seems to be less relevant to the students, okay? So Jack, who has the same physical substrate and being as the Sync Ambassador, Jack, definitely alive, Sync Ambassador, they don't know, right? Eve, who Jack can coexist with Eve. They say Eve, they're not feeling so good about Eve. And Sculptor 472, who's in this very strange physical substrate, doesn't matter, definitely alive, right? Even though the humans, and if we just encountered it, wouldn't recognize it in all likelihood as alive. They look like these trees of ice, okay? The other interesting thing about this is that the perspective really matters. So one thing I haven't told you is in the short stories, you get Sculptor and Jack's from a first-person point of view. You are immersed in them. You know what Sculptor is feeling, relationship with his father, his strive to continue his existence. And that, without a doubt, the students say, that character is alive. So substrate, the physical matter, and I think this is really important. Once you get beyond that, it becomes easier to see how artificial intelligence could really possibly gain a human-like status. And you'll see another example here in a second as well. But it also creates a problem, right? Because I can't get inside another creature like I can in a short story. Okay? So, and to give an example of this, so this question of synthetic consciousness, could I create consciousness from assembly? So when I was a graduate student in neuroengineering, I did a lab rotation through a lab and did this technique. There's a lab technique called brain slice. So you can take the brain out of a rodent very quickly, immerse it in oxygen and all appropriate artificial fluids, keep it alive. Cube it, right? So now you got a little cube, put it on this little vibrating knife, and you cut it into these 300 micron sections. Now you've got these slices. And you get something that looks like this. So you go from the whole organism, you get the brain out, you get this slice. This happens to be in a common area, the hippocampus, which is part of your brain. It's very important in learning and memory. It's also an important foci in a lot of epilepsy. And you can take, and one of the reasons people do this is because you can keep intact networks, and you can keep it alive all day. And in fact, now you can do these organotypic cultures where you can keep the network intact and culture it for a while. And when I was doing this, I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a sort of a philosophical thinker in my science, but I kept thinking, this reductionist, when do you lose awareness? When do you lose, imagine this is me. Right? Imagine we take your arms away. Are you still you? Are you aware? Yes. And in fact, and some people have phantom limb even experiences, right? Imagine I lose all of my body, right? Am I still me? Is my nervous system? Yes. Imagine I lose my eyes. I can't see, right? Take away all physical form. Take away my spinal cord, and I'm just my brain. Is my brain still aware? It's quite possible. Say I take a hemisphere out, right? We've done these surgeries in the past. Hemispherectomies. People live and awake without whole hemispheres gone. At what point from this reduction do you lose consciousness and awareness, right? So flip this around. If I'm bioengineering a brain, right? When does consciousness emerge? Or can it, right? If I assemble cells, if I got it right in the right pattern, could I, and this is an area of neuroscience that we don't yet understand. There's a lot of technology happening right now to try to get at understanding of how the brain really works to create things like intelligence, but right now we don't know. And so could I assemble a neural construct from either circuit? So if you said if substrate doesn't matter, if I could make circuits that behave like a neuron and assemble them, like theoretically, I say sure, I don't see any reason why this would be impossible. Part of the problem is, how would I know, right? I can't have the first person perspective that's given to me in vacuum diagrams. I can't communicate with that brain slice. How do I know what it's experiencing, right? I wouldn't. So this is part of our problem. And this raises a whole lot of issues when thinking about synthetic life and AI, what makes us human. And this question of substrate is kind of hardware versus software, right? Is humanity in the biological substrate? Or is it in our software? Is in humanity in the input-output functions and interaction with the outside world? And again, this is in very engineering terms. Other people would still say there's something beyond human understanding and beyond the physics of us that we'll never get, right? And I don't know. It brings in much more practical questions of, synthetic manipulation of higher function. Okay, the neuroengineering right now is mostly focused on preventing seizures, enabling people who have lost prosthetics, to enable people who've lost the ability to manipulate their body in the outside world to regain that. But who's to say that we can't take this into more sort of higher order function of the brain? And then what about identity and free will and responsibility and all these things? Okay? And I like to show this. I'll read this to you in case it's hard to see. But I want to show you, this is the actual abstract from a neuroengineering workshop a few years ago now, spring 2010, sponsored by the Army. And so this is sort of putting it back in the context of superintelligence. So this statement here says, as with the field of neuroprosthetics, which has reached critical mass, it seems inevitable that the use of brain-controlled devices will extend beyond clinical need into cognitive and physical augmentation of healthy individuals. Okay, so people are already talking about this sort of thing. So as we're talking about AI, I think it's important to talk about this hybrid environment. Might the path to superintelligence be to make humans part computer? Rather than making computers more like us, trying to re-engineer, reverse engineer the brain, or what have you, might we connect computer functions and algorithms to us? Right? That's another possible route. Now, no judgment on whether or not we should. That's a whole different question, right? But I think this is important, and in the AI community to sort of, there's not a lot happening between sort of the mainstream neuroengineering and AI. There is and there isn't, but there's a lot more in common, I think, here in the future than maybe what we've talked about today. So, okay, so we talked a lot in the last couple slides about a lot of, it's philosophical, a lot of questions of consciousness that I don't even know how to approach quite yet. But coming back into sort of the practical world, right? When you talk to people, as I do, many of the most common themes of risks and concerns about all these sort of biotechnologies fit into biosecurity, bioterrorism and war, biosafety, or sort of this new to bioerrorism, human mistakes, right? Environmental, biology can be unpredictable. Might we unintentionally wreak havoc? Does this further separate humans from quote-unquote nature? And another thing that comes up from some people is this visceral reaction that it's unnatural, right? And so this are a couple of the questions I want to address. Let's first talk about technology and destruction, okay? So on one hand, as technology has progressed, actually, human violence, some argue, has actually dramatically decreased. That we right now are much less likely to die at the hands of another human than our pre-technology predecessors, and that this has gradually decreased over time. There's a really great TED Talk by Steven Pinker who makes this argument. I recommend checking it out if you want to sort of think more about this. But so that's one statement that people argue. So this gives us sort of a check in the technology column, I guess, if we've got this scorecard in what we've been doing to ourselves, right? So on the other hand, as we progress our technology, we've sort of done what another guy, Robert Wright, calls the increasing lethality of our hatred. So technology amplifies. So you imagine way back, in a hunter-gatherer, tribal, early pre-technology or early technology state, it's difficult to imagine one person killing a lot of people around the world, right? Technology has increased the ability of one person to impact a large group of people, right? And we unfortunately experience this and hear about this in the news a lot, okay? So so we'll put a negative in the sort of our scorecard of technology. Along those lines, as we talk about emerging technologies, we can imagine, right? It's the doom, part of the doom of the dawn or doom. If AI doesn't kill us, we're also giving ourselves all kinds of ways to kill each other, right? Another sort of X. But it's important in the risk to also consider, we cannot forget, as we're considering our own extinction and how it could happen, we can't forget the natural possibilities of extinction, right? Don't forget that the 1918 Spanish influenza infected 1/5 of the world's population, right? 28% of Americans. It killed 20 to 40 million people, something like that, right? So some of these new technologies, synthetic biology may be our best bet, and probably is, for the rapid production of vaccines, the kinds of things we need to fight infectious disease. Also in the news right now, right? A lot of these things with ISIS and Ebola dominating our news right now, we can sort of see examples of these things in our lives. And so we have to remember that doing nothing, like Sophie said, we're going to completely ban this advance of technology. Doing nothing is a choice that also carries risk, and that has to be part of the equation as well. So where in the world does this leave us, right? Well, part of the problem is this scorecard thing, and looking at technology as the sole driving factor. So the National Academies has recognized and encouraged everyone to consider this myth of technological determinism. Okay, technological determinism is this idea that technology is this governing force for societal change. It shapes us, society's values, and drives our history, right? And that social progress is driven by technological innovation. And we can sort of go to that from some of the conversations we were just having. But I call this a myth, and it's implicitly embedded in our collective thinking, unless we explicitly realize that it is. So we think many of us, I know in my elementary school education, right, we had these historical teachings. You know, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, slavery there was more demand for slaves, and it contributed to the Civil War, right? Gutenberg invented the printing press, put the Bible in the hands of all the masses, and it fueled the Reformation. I put this last one in to see if you were paying attention. Right, technology suddenly appears. Usually there's some genius who's somehow separate from the rest of humanity, seems very different than us, right? And this amazing invention that seems to come out of nowhere dramatically affects everyone, right? And drives social change. The problem with this, besides just totally being not the way it actually works, is that this decouples all of us as individuals from technology development. It totally ignores the societal forces that drove the technology, right? And it sort of leaves us feeling that the outcomes are inevitable. And so, you know, the National Academies encourages us to consider the other half of this and the societal driving the technology. And I put these action items in. I always try to intentionally put sort of actions in there because I give these talks, and a lot of times you read papers and talks on these ideas, and it's all these questions. And we just raise more questions and more questions. And what do we do? Well, one thing that's clear that we need to do is that we need to improve the technical literacy of everyone, right? That will help in this. And we need to work hard on the hatred, right? And the things, that lethality of our hatred. We can blame the technology, and it plays a role, but we also have to address the other half of that. And that engineers need to understand the societal forces driving their technologies. It's this is an argument, very important argument, for the role of liberal arts in our STEM and the role that the liberal arts plays in this whole force, and not being a separate thing from science, technology, and engineering. Okay. Onto this topic. This is a hard one, right? Because, so does synthetic equal unnatural? Right? And there are some people, it depends sort of a lot on your context and your background and your religion and all your sort of world point of view, sort of how, and people can have very strong feelings, and they can't always even articulate why. It's one of the things that's great about this honors class that I do is that students get to sort of understand their own opinions and try to tease apart why do they feel that way, right? So, and one of the things I've sort of learned, one of the biggest driving factors of how people, where they fall on these synthetic life technologies, whether they're natural or unnatural, seems to be their sort of worldview of how they place humans in the context of the world and nature. Right? So do you view humans as a part of nature, a biological organism that's evolved like everything else, and that we're sort of an equal part of nature? Or do you view humans as unique, dominant over, and or external to what we call nature? And sort of how you view humans' role in all of that seems to play a bit of a role, along with many other things. So there are sort of two extremes to this argument, go something like this. So one extreme might say technology is humans' evolutionary advantage, right? It is our biological advantage. It's what we've evolved to do to survive, right? And so therefore, all synthetic life technology is natural because we're part of nature. It's our evolutionary advantage. We're just part of the ecosystem. And if you want to read more about this, Pugwash had Howard Bloom come talk a couple years ago. He's got some really interesting things to say about that. You can check out one of his books if you're sort of interested in this. And in this argument, the technology is sort of inherently neutral in and of itself. People can do bad things with it. People can do good things with it. On the other extreme says we are arrogant and we have no right to engineer life, right? And therefore, all synthetic life technology is unnatural. There's actually some value in considering both of these sides. And most people, and there is a point here, right? I mean, we do tend to be sort of arrogant, and probably if we ever do cause our own extinction, I'm sure our arrogance will probably play a big role in that. But for all of us, sort of our religious, our scientific, our personal backgrounds inform this worldview, and it doesn't necessarily fall along science versus religion, right? Because you can actually I've heard religious arguments made on either sides. Religious arguments that say that we are stewards of the earth, it is our responsibility. If we have the capability to create technology to reduce human suffering, that we have the moral obligation to do so, right? You can also, I've heard religious arguments made in the context of frameworks that it is not our place to be engineering other organisms, okay? So there's many grades in between these extremes, and there's a lot of value in discussing them. So I want to be sure to leave time for some questions, and there's many things that I could have and wanted to cover, directions we could go for the conversation. I just want to highlight them to sort of plant seeds in your mind. One, we have a lot of cognitive illusions when we do risk assessment of technologies and decision makings. It's very important that we sort of recognize those. Ethical frameworks, one of the things my students do is sort of testing the sufficiency for bioethics frameworks, current like principalism, for evaluating synthetic and hybrid life technologies. Global oversight, this is a theme that a lot of students sort of pull out. Laws and regulations are federal. A lot of moral frameworks are cultural. But the impact and reality of these technologies is global. So how do we reconcile that? There was another talk, maybe some of you attended, on moral status of modified and synthetic organisms in humans. Another really important direction to consider and think about. So just some other seeds of thought, and I'll say thank you, and hopefully you will all sort of continue the conversation. Yeah.
There was a recent TED Talk that featured Nicholas Negromonte
Uh-huh.
from the MIT Media Lab.
Uh-huh.
And at the end, they asked him for a prediction of what he thought would be coming down the pipe.
Yeah.
And he said he thought in 30 years or less, you could take a pill and instantly be fluent in foreign language. Doesn't that strike you? This was like a
Yeah.
high-powered person.
A pill? If I were a betting woman, I would probably bet no. Is it theoretically possible to be like Neo and download knowledge? I think it's theoretically possible. Will we do that in 30 years? I don't think so. Yeah, they always do, right?
How close are we to being able to, say, have a brain-machine interface that can communicate as well as, say, typing and using a mouse?
So that was the very first example. So BrainGate was, John Donahue's lab was sort of the first example. They implanted electrodes, an array of electrodes into a patient's brain, and that patient can train to control a cursor, right? So this is with direct neural implant. A lot of the hurdles have been in the practical things, making them smaller, the packaging, making it last for decades. Now the thing with that one, the biocompatibility, that patient would have to retrain every day because the association. So that interface, the biocompatibility, the communication, is one of the areas people have been working on to make that stable for chronic periods of time. But that's very close. I mean, that's happening now.
Well, I meant really as fast as possible.
Oh, as fast.
Not just, A, and then you think
Yeah.
about 15 seconds, and E.
Yeah, that's a good, so one of the things there's sort of this, there's a question of information processing. How much information do you need to extract from the brain? How much do you have to record from? Right, and that's been a problem of, again, this biocompatibility and the size. So theoretically, if you could record from every single neuron, right, makes that problem much, much easier. And there's been a lot of progress. This is why Pedro's lab is putting them all around the brain, for example. I actually just started, there's a huge influx of, there's an influx of money, huge interest right now in advancing technologies. I have a grant with a collaborator at NIH. Now that we're making nanotechnology and microtechnologies smaller and smaller, we're actually working on tiny chips that can go inside neurons and wirelessly communicate, right? So now you could theoretically record from thousands of neurons at once, making your problem of this sort of rapid information extraction and controlling more dimensions of control of the outside world requires more recording in the brain. And that's been what's sort of holding that back. Again, this interface, the practical problem. But that's advancing too. That's much more near term and is a tractable problem.
All right, it looks like we're out of time. Thank you for coming. Please remember the keynote speaker is next at 5 p.m. in Fowler Hall, so please be sure to go there. Thank you.